You're not confused about what needs to change. Nothing is missing or hidden. The actions have been obvious for a long time, circling your mind like unfinished business you refuse to close. Train your body. Finish the work. Make the call you keep avoiding. Start the project you keep pushing forward as if delay will solve it. You already know, almost to the point of irritation, that if you executed these basics consistently, your life wouldn't just improve, it would reorganize. Strength would replace fatigue. Leverage would replace stress. Control would take the place of anxiety. Self-respect would stop collapsing under pressure. And yet nothing moves. Not today, not tomorrow, not consistently. The space between knowing and doing is where the real damage forms. That's where quiet self-contempt grows. You don't say it out loud, but you feel it late at night when distractions stop working. And the thought hits that time is slipping away. So you explain it away. You call it being tired. You promise tomorrow will be different. You wait for motivation like it's coming to rescue you. Underneath those excuses sits a sharper fear. The suspicion that the problem isn't circumstances, it's you, that you're undisciplined, soft, built wrong. That belief feels brutal, but it's false. You're not failing because you lack strength. You're failing because part of you is designed to avoid resistance at any cost. A part that favors comfort, certainty, and smooth paths. Every time you aim at something demanding, it intervenes quietly. Not with panic, but with delay. A distraction, a rationalization, a negotiation that convinces you to wait just long enough for momentum to die. That's why the work itself is never the real obstacle. The work is clear, uncomfortable, but simple. The real battle happens earlier, in the seconds before you begin. That narrow window where you still have control before doubt, fear, and excuses rush in to take over. That moment decides everything. Miss it, and you repeat the same loop, learning more, wanting more, and staying exactly where you are. You were taught to believe your mind is your strongest weapon. Think harder, plan smarter, outsmart the problem, and you win. It sounds empowering, but it quietly traps you. Your brain was never built for greatness. It was built for survival. And survival doesn't care about who you could become later. It only cares about keeping you safe right now. That's why it pulls you toward comfort, predictability, and quick relief. While growth demands uncertainty, discomfort, and effort that only pays off in the future. This is why the moment before action feels so heavy. Starting is registered as danger. Your mind isn't a strategist, it's a guard whose job is prevention. Hunger feels like risk. Rejection feels like risk. Fatigue, embarrassment, exposure all get flagged as threats. So when you aim at something meaningful, something that requires sustained effort with no guarantee, the guard doesn't support you, it restricts you. It slows movement. It delays decisions. It offers comfort disguised as protection. That's why safety feels natural and effort feels wrong. Comfort feels familiar. Action feels reckless. Not because you're broken, but because your mind serves the body before it serves your future. It will gladly trade long-term potential for short-term relief, then justify avoidance as smart. Once you see this clearly, the self-blame weakens. You stop calling yourself lazy. You stop fighting blindly. The conflict finally has a name. Your mind protects your body, not your destiny. And until you accept that, hesitation will keep draining momentum day after day. Your mind exists to preserve your body, not to fulfill your potential. And once you grasp that, the next truth becomes impossible to ignore. The world has learned how to exploit that instinct with precision. Modern life is designed to remove effort from nearly everything. Food appears without movement. Entertainment begins without waiting. Approval comes without exposure or risk. Almost nothing now demands endurance, and anything that does feels unnecessary, even threatening. Comfort is no longer something you earn. It's the default condition you're submerged in. This is how willpower erodes quietly, not through weakness, but through design. When relief is always immediate, effort starts to feel unnatural. Resistance feels like a flaw instead of a requirement. Over time, the capacity to push through friction dulls. Inaction feels reasonable. Doing something hard feels excessive, even irresponsible. And power cannot survive in that environment. Power is forged only where effort is required and sustained. A world that constantly feeds you produces consumers. A world that demands something from you produces builders. One group absorbs, reacts, and waits. The other chooses, acts, and shapes outcomes. One is fed, the other hunts. This isn't moral judgment, it's clarity. That restlessness you feel, the distraction, the low-grade frustration, they aren't signs that something is wrong with you. They're signals. You were never designed to live permanently comfortable and permanently harmless. A world engineered to remove effort doesn't just make life easier, it conditions you to hesitate. And that hesitation is where nearly every plan you've ever cared about quietly collapsed. The issue was never a lack of discipline, motivation, or ambition. The real failure happens in the brief space between deciding and acting, when you pause just long enough for your mind to step in and start negotiating. Intention is always clean. You decide to train, to write, to handle the hardest task first. In that instant, everything feels aligned and controlled. Then your body doesn't move, and your mind enters the conversation pretending to help. It doesn't attack you. It reasons with you. It offers delay disguised as intelligence. It suggests later, easier, safer options. That narrow gap turns into a courtroom where every excuse sounds rational enough to win. At the gym, the plan is solid until the couch lowers your posture and your mind reminds you that rest matters. That consistency beats intensity. That missing one session won't change anything. You don't quit. You postpone. Writing dies the same way. The idea feels alive until the blank page demands commitment. Then preparation replaces production. Research replaces output. Polishing replaces creating. Time drains away, energy fades, and nothing exists except the illusion that you were busy. Work collapses by the same pattern. The uncomfortable email, the decisive move, the task that would actually change your position, stays untouched while you drown yourself in low-risk busy work that feels productive but shifts nothing. This isn't a personal flaw. It's conditioning. You live in an environment that rewards delay with relief and punishes action with discomfort. So your brain learns that negotiation equals survival. Every time you hesitate and feel better, the pattern hardens. Delay becomes automatic. Action starts to feel reckless. Over time, something worse than procrastination takes shape. You begin trusting excuses more than your own intentions. Your word to yourself becomes flexible. Standards blur. Confidence erodes without a single dramatic failure. On the surface, you still look functional, responsible, capable. Internally, you're practicing powerlessness. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, it isn't coincidence. It's repetition. You've been running this loop longer than you want to admit, and it feels accurate because you're watching the exact mechanism that has been deciding your days. Plans don't collapse because they're unrealistic or too ambitious. They collapse because you allow negotiation to happen at all. That pause is not harmless. It's the precise moment control changes hands. Leave the gap open, and even strong intentions bleed out quietly. Close it, and momentum no longer needs motivation. This is the line most people never notice, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every excuse sounds intelligent. That's exactly why they work. Once you see that negotiation is the true enemy, one rule becomes unavoidable, and it aligns with every principle that came before it. Control is lost. The instant emotion is allowed to speak first. Power does not originate from confidence, clarity, or motivation. It begins the moment the body acts before the mind has time to object. Waiting to feel ready is not patience. It is surrender disguised as wisdom. Emotion is not a leader. It is a commentator. It reacts after action, then invents explanations that make the outcome feel justified. Yet most people reverse this order. They treat feeling as authority and action as something that must be approved. Machiavelli understood this pattern well. Those who hesitate invite disorder. Those who move first impose reality. Look at how power functions in the real world. The first person to stand controls attention. The first to move dictates the frame. Action creates facts, and facts force interpretation to follow. The mind does not lead behavior. It rationalizes it. That is why fear collapses the moment movement begins. At the gym, nothing magical happens. The weight is the same. The resistance remains. But once the body commits to the first rep, doubt loses leverage. Writing obeys the same law. One sentence dismantles the illusion of difficulty. The page stops threatening and starts complying. Work is no different. Opening the document, making the call, initiating the task dissolves hours of internal resistance instantly. Emotion never fades on its own. It submits only after action proves it irrelevant. This is why those who wait for motivation remain trapped in endless preparation, while those who act under doubt accumulate momentum without belief. Confidence is not the cause of action. It is the after effect. Intelligent people fail here because they try to reason their way into authority. Machiavelli would call that weakness. Power is never negotiated internally. It is asserted. You do not convince yourself into control. You demonstrate it. The body commits. The mind adjusts. Authority is established through action, not argument. And once you understand this, the question is no longer why you hesitate, but why you ever thought hesitation deserved a vote at all. Pain doesn't arrive to block your progress. It arrives to see whether you'll give back the control you just claimed. And this is where most people misread the signal and retreat. The moment action goes first and emotion is forced into a secondary role, discomfort enters like a checkpoint. The average person interprets that sensation as an error. Something aches. Something tightens. Resistance appears, and immediately the mind concludes that the choice was wrong, the timing was off, or the line was crossed too early. That interpretation feels rational, even mature. But it isn't wisdom. It's conditioning. Power follows a different logic. Pain is not evidence of failure. It's evidence of separation. It marks the boundary between a life where effort was optional and a territory where demands increase. Look at the body, and the pattern becomes obvious. Muscle only adapts when it's stressed beyond familiarity. The burn under the weight isn't a warning to escape. It's the signal that adaptation has been triggered. Comfort has never produced strength, and avoidance has never produced authority. Skill obeys the same law. Writing feels heavy before it feels fluid. Words resist before they align. The tension isn't proof of inadequacy, it's the cost of upgrading capacity. Those who quit there don't fall apart. They simply stay who they were. The same applies to psychological effort. Acting without reassurance feels sharp. Silence feels exposed. Accountability feels threatening. To the untrained, those sensations read as danger, so they retreat to comfort. where nothing demands anything of them. To the trained, the exact same sensations confirm that something real is happening. Pressure only shows up where construction is underway. Pain only appears where identity is being challenged. This is why movement alone is not enough. Once you act, discomfort attempts to reclaim authority by reframing action itself as a mistake. If emotion is allowed to reinterpret pain, hesitation quietly returns and control slips without notice. This is the exact moment most people turn back. Not because they lack ability, but because the sensation feels personal. Hold your position and pain changes meaning. It stops signaling threat and starts offering direction. Comfort preserves weakness by keeping everything familiar. Discomfort removes protection, strips away excuses, and exposes gaps you can no longer hide from. To a mind organized around survival, that exposure feels dangerous. To someone building authority, it feels accurate. This is the dividing line between people who try once and people who actually change. Growth always lives at the edge where safety dissolves and reality sharpens. That edge always resists. It always hurts. Misread it and you retreat into repetition. Understand it and you pass through. If this feels uncomfortably precise, it's because you're standing exactly where expansion begins. Discomfort doesn't push you forward or backward on its own. It simply reveals a doorway, and what decides the outcome is who you believe you are when you reach it. This is the point where most people fall back into the same life they swear they want to escape, because pain exposes the edge. But without a shift in identity, that edge feels threatening instead of instructive. This is why habits collapse under pressure. Habits are actions you try to repeat. Identity is the authority that decides whether action happens at all. Most people attempt discipline while keeping the same internal role, the role that still waits for emotion to approve the next move. Discomfort appears, and the first question they ask is, "Do I want to keep going?" And in that moment, control is handed back to weakness. People with internal authority never ask that question. Desire is irrelevant. Mood is irrelevant. Comfort has no vote. They operate on a colder rule. Is this required? That single shift changes everything because it removes emotion from command. When identity is unclear, every sensation becomes a decision maker. Pain speaks and action listens. Fatigue negotiates and standards soften. Fear raises a concern and momentum stalls. That's why consistency never survives resistance. Structured people function differently. Pain is noticed, not obeyed. Emotion is felt, not consulted. Discomfort doesn't trigger debate because the decision was made before sensation arrived. This isn't willpower, it's hierarchy. One person feels pain and interprets it as a signal to stop. Another feels the same pain and reads it as confirmation they're exactly where they need to be. One retreats, the other advances without drama. The difference has nothing to do with motivation and everything to do with identity. If you see yourself as someone who reacts, pressure will always win. If you see yourself as someone who fulfills requirements, action stops being personal and becomes procedural. That's why discipline feels cruel to emotional people and almost effortless to powerful ones. One bleeds energy through internal argument. The other has already decided who's in charge. Identity locks in. Behavior stabilizes. Pain loses leverage because it can't renegotiate authority. And if this is landing uncomfortably close, stay with it. Because the next part shows how to rebuild identity, so discomfort stops controlling the direction of your life. Most people say their problem is inconsistency, but that word only describes the surface damage. The real failure runs deeper, a lack of internal order. When there is no hierarchy inside the mind, Everything becomes personal, and anything personal becomes negotiable. A thought appears and demands attention. An emotion reacts and insists on being respected. A sensation flares and asks to be accommodated. Action doesn't collapse because discipline is missing. It collapses because there is no chain of command. When every internal voice believes it deserves equal authority, nothing is ever final. This is why identity alone doesn't solve the problem. Even after you stop asking what you want and start asking what is required, things still fall apart if the same part of you is responsible for both deciding and acting. When the chooser and the executor are fused, authority is unstable by default. The moment pressure appears, the decision is dragged back into debate. Fatigue pleads for mercy. Fear asks for reconsideration. Logic arrives dressed in clean language and argues for delay. You stay busy. You feel occupied. But nothing actually moves because nothing has been settled. Motion without finality creates the illusion of effort, while progress quietly stalls. Internal power stabilizes only when roles are divided. One part of you exists to decide. One part exists to execute. The deciding part does not operate under urgency. It functions when emotion is quiet and perspective is wide. It sets standards without negotiating with comfort and without explaining itself to fear. It makes the decision once, clearly, and then steps aside. Its job ends the moment the choice is made. The executing part is built differently. It does not ask why. It does not check how it feels. It does not reinterpret instructions under stress. It moves. It enforces what has already been chosen. The most common mistake people make is allowing execution to reopen discussion. The second that happens, hierarchy dissolves and negotiation floods back in. This is where exhaustion is born, not from effort, but from argument. People aren't tired because they're doing too much. They're drained because every action must first be justified. Every task becomes emotional labor before it becomes real labor. You argue with yourself all day and call it discipline. When structure is installed, that friction disappears. Emotion doesn't vanish. It is contained. Pain can be felt without changing direction. Fatigue can be noticed without delaying action. Fear can be acknowledged without being obeyed. This isn't cruelty, it's order. Real power is quiet. Where hierarchy is missing, chaos fills the gap. Where roles are defined, excuses have nowhere to hide. One decides, one executes, nothing argues. And that is the difference between effort that drains you and effort that compounds. When the mind is arranged into order, a subtle change happens almost instantly. The second decision and execution stop arguing. Pleasure loses its grip. Pleasure only has power where there is internal chaos. It feeds on impulse, noise, and relief. It arrives quickly, feels good for a moment, and leaves nothing behind. You scroll, you snack, you distract yourself. For a brief window, the pressure fades and it feels like rest. Then it returns heavier than before because nothing actually shifted. Nothing durable was created. That loop is where most people live, confusing temporary relief with real recovery. Completion operates by a different rule entirely. Completion has weight. It doesn't spike and vanish. It settles into you. When you finish something difficult, not something busy or cosmetic, but something you resisted and still enforced, the reward isn't excitement. It's stillness. A quiet calm that fills the chest and straightens the body without effort. That stillness is dignity, and it doesn't need an audience. The same feeling appears when you keep a promise to yourself that no one else ever knew existed. You get up when quitting would have gone unnoticed. You finish when stopping would have been easy to justify. There's no applause, no validation. Yet something internal locks into place. Your word gains weight. You begin to trust yourself without needing reassurance. That's why pleasure always feels thin, while completion feels substantial. Pleasure softens you because it asks nothing in return. Completion hardens you because it demands payment before it delivers. People confuse happiness with stimulation and wonder why comfort leaves them restless. Dignity doesn't excite you, it stabilizes you. It anchors you to standards that don't rise and fall with mood. When decisions are final and execution follows, completion becomes unavoidable. And when completion becomes routine, dignity compounds quietly. Pleasure always asks for more. Completion gives permission to stop. Pleasure keeps you dependent on the next hit. Completion makes you self-contained. One feeds impulse, the other feeds structure. That's why people surrounded by ease often feel fragile, while those under pressure feel composed. Pressure gives them something solid to stand on. Dignity is never loud. It shows up in posture, timing, and restraint. It makes you harder to manipulate because you're no longer desperate for relief. Over time, this rewires desire. You stop chasing feeling good and start valuing being intact. Action stops being emotional and becomes enforcement. Pleasure disappears the moment it's consumed. Completion accumulates and stays. The person who lives on that weight no longer needs motivation, because breaking their own standards would feel heavier than any effort required to uphold them. The moment pleasure stops being your regulator and dignity takes its place, the environment reacts, and that reaction is intentional. Comfort begins to feel questionable, not because it's wrong, but because it no longer governs you, and that loss of influence unsettles people. Opinions surface quickly. You're told you're pushing too hard, taking things too seriously, losing balance, or living like effort is a form of self-punishment. But those reactions aren't about your behavior. They're about what your behavior forces others to confront. Most people are incapable of sustained effort without immediate payoff. So when they encounter someone who can endure without reward, they don't examine their own avoidance. They relabel your standards as unhealthy. Discipline does this naturally. It exposes what's been abandoned. Broken promises, lowered expectations, potential quietly exchanged for convenience. That exposure creates pressure, and pressure demands release. Calling you extreme is easier than admitting their own softness. Comfort functions as an unspoken social pact. Everyone stays level by keeping demands low and resistance optional. The second you step outside that pact, the balance shifts. You don't complain about the work. You don't seek relief to manage your mood. You don't need constant stimulation to stay functional. That silence, reinforced by consistency, feels threatening even when you say nothing. To those who depend on ease, it reads as judgment. This is why strength is rarely welcomed by the comfortable. Not because it's harsh, but because it doesn't validate their choices. Comfort looks for reassurance. Discipline delivers outcomes. One asks permission to stay the same. The other accepts responsibility and moves forward. People organized around pleasure need others to confirm that pleasure is sufficient. When you build a life around completion and dignity, that illusion collapses. You are incompatible. Incompatibility is always punished before it is respected. When discipline starts to separate you from the comfortable majority, a truth comes into focus. You are constructing sovereignty. This is not dominance over others, but absolute authority over yourself. Without that authority, freedom is just a comforting myth. If you don't command your body, it moves only when comfort approves. If you don't command your attention, it is owned by whatever is loudest or most addictive. If you don't command your actions, your life is steered by impulse and circumstance. That isn't choice, it's compliance disguised as independence. Most people believe they are free because they aren't physically restrained. Yet their days are dictated by fatigue and emotional shifts. They wake up reacting and lose hours without resistance. Sovereignty begins the moment you refuse to excuse this pattern. You don't need to be extreme, you need to be exact. You must decide who holds authority when pressure appears. The distinction most miss is this: slavery isn't effort. Slavery is being unable to move when action is required, or needing emotional permission before doing what must be done. Sovereignty is the quiet ability to direct yourself when no one is watching and nothing feels immediately rewarding. This ability reshapes how you stand in the world. Your body responds to command, and your actions become deliberate. You become harder to manipulate because relief no longer controls you, and harder to derail because discomfort doesn't dictate your choices. Internal sovereignty reveals itself through consistency and the absence of excuses. When you can decide, focus, and act on demand, life stops pushing you around. You are no longer moved without consent. That is true freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to do what must be done regardless of how it feels. Everything you've just absorbed becomes worthless if it ends at understanding, because comprehension alone has never altered a life. And this is where most content quietly dies. Insight feels powerful, even addictive. But when it doesn't move the body, it's cheap. It creates the illusion of progress while behavior stays untouched. And that illusion is why people binge ideas endlessly and still feel stuck. The real test doesn't happen while you're listening. It arrives the second the screen goes dark and silence rushes back in. Silence is dangerous because it removes distraction. And in that space, the old reflex returns. Scroll a bit more. Save this for later. Apply it tomorrow. When things feel calmer, clearer, safer. That voice is not harmless. That is the final negotiation. This is the moment where everything you've just heard is either enforced or discarded. The difference between people who change and people who don't isn't intelligence or awareness. It's timing. The ones who change act while the signal is still alive. They don't wait for certainty. They don't hunt for motivation. They move while resistance is still present, while discomfort hums in the chest. So don't look for a dramatic reset or a perfect plan. Choose one real thing you've been avoiding. Not a symbolic task, not an easy win, but the one that would immediately reduce your excuses. Decide now, privately, because postponement is how authority slips away. Anchor it. Do something concrete and uncomfortable. Name it. Put it in the comments, not for approval, but because naming removes camouflage and turns intention into pressure. And if this way of thinking cut deeper than expected, subscribe, not to consume more ideas, but to mark the standard you just accepted. This isn't about extremism or joylessness. It's about refusing to let clarity rot into comfort. Knowledge without movement is decoration. Awareness without enforcement is noise. Power belongs to the ones who move, and hesitation will test that truth again within minutes.